Okay, it should be up and rolling, Jill. Got audio? Great, glorious. Okay, so what I managed to find is a selection of laws from the Code of Hammurabi, which I can't remember. Did we even end up talking about Code of Hammurabi at all? We kind of briefly mentioned it, I think. Maybe. Okay, so Code of Hammurabi. That's almost as hard as saying Habakkuk. Code of Hammurabi comes out of the Babylonian Empire, circa 1700 BCE, or as it used to be called, just BC. And it is extensive. Okay, there are over 300 laws that make up the Code of Hammurabi. It comes off of a stela. Yeah. Stella. Oh, sorry. That's what my grandma. Oh, if you saw SNL last night. Yeah. And like I said, it's extensive. So the thing that I was really struggling to find was a list of any of them. But thankfully, after some deep internet searching, somebody had kind of gone through and pulled out, a couple of 50 of them. But according to, you remember last week I mentioned that they are organized by category, right? So there's a couple of them from each category. We're not going to go through all of these. We could spend all day with that. But the ones that I would invite you to pay particular attention to, and feel free to, skim through these over the course of the class today, especially when it gets boring, is the family ones, okay? Because that's what we're going to look at eventually today. And you'll notice that the family ones are the most extensive. So we're going to come back to that in a second. But again, this is, I don't know how you feel about this. I find this extremely fascinating because, and again, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it gives us such an interesting glimpse into what the world was like in that day and age. What it was like to live, for example, in the Babylonian Empire in quote unquote biblical times, which is a very broad category. But again, it shows us what it would have been like to be a common citizen, in this world. And one of the things that seems to be consistent is that, and again, the ancient world was very hierarchical. Is that you essentially had the wealthy, the noble, the elite. You had everybody else, and then you had slaves at the bottom. This seems to be the thing that is consistent. And in the Code of Hammurabi, similar to the two that we looked at last week, slaves, at least according to the code, are less human than other humans, right? So you notice that the punishment, for example, hurting a slave is much less. So like personal injury, laws 195 through 214. If a son strikes his father, they shall cut off his hand. Whew. What about wrestles with his dad? Is that, is there a punishment for that? I was always testing my father's strength when I was a teenager. Does anybody, I don't know if maybe girls do this too, but it seemed to be a son thing.
It's a father-son thing about wrestling on the floor.
Yes, yeah. Does that, do I lose a hand for that, or? Right, yeah.
Who enforces these laws?
That's a really good question, Marlena. So the best kind of in that day and age, there is not a police force as we would understand it, because there is essentially a military which does everything. Okay, and something that you have to keep in mind is that most societies had two major components that made up their militaries, which is you had quote-unquote professional soldiers, and when they weren't at war, professional soldiers might serve as a policing force, they might serve as a bodyguard for wealthy people, and then you had the citizens militia. So, Babylonian Empire, Assyrian Empire, Egyptian Empire, what generally armies were made up of were a few professionals, maybe their elite unit, and a militia that was recruited from the populace that, you were equipped with some rudimentary weapons and armor and sent to be cannon fodder, essentially. bleak existence during the war. Andy.
Well, what I liked about this is the fact that it was, one, codified.
Mm-hmm.
That means written down.
Yep.
And distributed.
Yes.
So it was.
Which was and this relates to the Habakkuk text, is that it's literally carved into a stone so that everybody can see it.
And therefore, we didn't have potential for a lawyer class to start developing.
Yes. No.
Just produce whatever the reader
So
wants.
this is a really important insight. I'm sorry, I need to remind myself. I need to repeat things for the stream, because I met with Shirley Meyer this week, and she's like, I love watching it, but I can't ever hear anybody else. So, Andy brought up a point that there are two really important pieces to this here. One is that it's codified, it's written down, so there is no debate essentially over what the appropriate response to a specific crime is. Now, obviously, right, and maybe you're already doing this thinking. Obviously, there is still room for interpretation, right? So what exactly defines striking your father, right? What is the severity of the strike that justifies the cutting off of a hand, right? But also, it's a law that is accessible by the populace, right? So it's not hidden behind, millions of words of books that nobody actually understands. It's fairly accessible to the populace. Now, understand that the literacy rate was probably not high, but the intent exists, which is the intent is that everybody should know what the rules are before they're punished by those rules. Which, and again, this is why this is such a fun topic to have, is I invite you to think about, in our modern legal system, in our modern world, we might look upon the Code of Hammurabi and say, oh boy, that's barbaric. Yeah, it is, right? But I would ask you, are you completely 100% clear on what the rules are in any given situation? How many times when you're entering a new state do you stop and ask, is this a right on red state? And again, living in the United States, it is much more complex because of state laws versus federal laws versus local laws. This, again, this drives Alain nuts, right? Because France, there is one state, that is Paris, right? There is one law, that is the federal law. You don't have to interpret, where am I and what are the rules that apply here? And that even tends to be consistent within the EU as well, too. You can go from France to Switzerland to Germany and know relatively confidently what the traffic laws are there. It's just in the U.S. where it's all up regret. So something fun to think about is, are you aware of what all the laws are governing, the things that the world that you navigate in? How many of you have accidentally broken tax law over the course of your life? Does anybody understand actually what tax law is, or how I'm supposed to file my taxes, since I'm self-employed and my FICA doesn't get paid by the church, so I have to pay? Okay, obviously this has been an issue.
I will confess to getting a fine for my taxes,
Right,
but I called the IRS to ask if this was correct, and they told me so. It was correct, and it wasn't. And I still got fined, and they said that's because it was up to me to know the law.
Exactly. I had the exact same situation.
Yeah.
Ignorance is not an excuse. Yeah.
But I asked them.
After my year that I got fined, I called the IRS and I said, this whole section that I'm getting fined over is very unclear to me. How should I do it next year? And they said, that's for you to know. Essentially. Yeah.
In that book they give you,
In the book they give you.
it is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, and then again, and I don't want to dig too far into this right now. We're going to talk about this very extensively as we get on. But we in this room are majority educated, literate, with the means to be able to pay tax fines without having to worry about the repercussions of an excessive fine. As we move into different aspects of our society, which may not have, even high school degrees and or college degrees, or may struggle with reading, like my cousin who is a physics professor but is also dyslexic, right? Or cannot afford to pay their taxes, much less pay fines, how does this affect things? So, all this to say, the Code of Hammurabi, while definitely a product of its time, has some intent there that's very noble, right? Which is, the law is accessible to everybody and theoretically applied evenly across the populace. Now again, we can and will poke plenty of holes into that, but it's 1700 BCE, folks. Yeah, so like, starting out, so if a son strikes his father, they cut off his hand. Now here we have lex talionis, right? The man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. But this is what I really get a kick out of, because again, with any law, right, there is always going to be a case outside the norm, and when that case comes up, then you have to come up with a new law to address that. So you kind of notice the progression here. If he destroys the eye of a plebeian, what's a plebeian? It's a commoner, essentially. If he destroys the eye, because I was saying we've got classes here. So obviously, or apparently, these first laws are probably referring more to the wealthy class. But if you destroy the eye of a plebeian, or break the bone of a plebeian, you shall pay one mina of silver? Okay, so let's talk about this. What happens if a noble gouges out the eye of somebody in the street, potentially whips them with a whip, because they're in the road, blocking the way of their carriage? They pay a fine, right? What happens if that commoner puts out the eye of a nobleman? Yeah, significant damage, right? Now, what happens if you do the same to a slave? It's like 10 shekels or something like that. I don't know.
It's half of his.
One half of his, yeah. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave, or breaks a bone of a man's slave, he shall pay one half the price of the slave, because you're essentially offsetting for the loss of labor, is what I understand here.
And in theory, that might be more than 1 mina of silver.
That may be, depending on how. Well, I don't know the relative cost of a slave in 17th century Babylon. It'd be an important thing. A couple of us did some research this week, which I thank you for. Susan texted me a conversion rate between shekels, and I forgot the specific numbers offhand, but that was very helpful. Also, Paula looked up, and yes, the shekel was a fairly common currency across the cultures in that region during that time. Then we go down to the man has struck a free. Okay, this is one I really want you to pay attention to. If a man has struck a free woman, okay, if this is anything similar to feudal Middle Ages Europe, this free person is one who has paid off their indebtedness and/or is not a sharecropper. It's not somebody who is living on the land of a noble person, theoretically.
Basically, in the middle class.
Theoretically, yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty good. So the man has struck a free woman with child and has caused her to miscarry, he shall pay 10 shekels for her miscarriage. Okay. The reason I want you to pay attention to this is when we get into the Levitical law, we are going to look at a couple of these passages relating to pregnancy as a way, and this might be a dangerous conversation, but as a way of talking about what the, at least Hebrew, treatment of quote-unquote abortion and or pre-birth looks like. So according to this, what's the relative value of an unborn infant?
10 shekels.
10 shekels, arguably less than a slave, less than a person. So again, if you're looking at this from a legal standpoint, the value of an unborn infant in this society at this time, they're not on par with at least a free person. Okay. The important social contextual issues as well is that in 17th century BCE, 18th century BCE, infant mortality rate is like 50-50, child mortality rate is not much better, right? This is why you have lots of kids, is because you need to have a whole purse full in the hopes that a couple of them make it to adulthood, So take that into consideration. That is the difference between our context and their context, okay? But again, just, pay attention to that stuff. If that woman die, this is a follow-up to Law 2:9, his daughter shall be killed. Whose daughter? So if a guy beats a woman, causes her to miscarry, and then she dies either in childbirth or because of this, is he killed?
No.
No. His daughter is killed.
What did she do?
What did she do? So if we're unclear as to the position of women in Babylonian society, well, they're better than slaves, right? Arguably better than if you're a plebeian, so a non-noble, right? But heaven forbid your dad has a drinking problem, right? And or is abusive. Okay, then if by a blow he has caused a plebeian's daughter to have miscarriage, he shall pay 5 shekels of silver, so half. So a noble's unborn child is 10 shekels, the plebeian's only 5.
And he's paying not her.
No.
He's paying the male.
Yes. She's not getting this money. Yeah.
What's the difference between, I've always thought of patricians and plebeians.
Yeah.
But now what's the difference between a free man and a plebeian?
That's an important question. I'm assuming, and feel free to check this out, I'm assuming that in this case, a plebeian is probably one of those citizens who is living on a noble's land, who is theoretically indebted to that person, but is, it's the same as a serf, right? And is that the right term? There's a villein in medieval terminology, right? Somebody who is living on a noble's land and farming it for him, right? So they're technically indebted to that noble, versus a free person who owns their shop or owns their property or whatever, is not owed taxes. Well, they still owe taxes.
But a slave is a slave.
A slave is a slave is a slave. Yeah. Plebeian, if that woman dies, it's half mina of silver. So fortunately, that if a noble beats a plebeian and if she dies, it's only half mina. It's not. He doesn't have to give up his
Mina
daughter.
is more or less.
Mina is
shekel
more.
than a
Yeah,
shekel.
mina is. How much is it? 50 shekels of mina, so 25 shekels. And then finally, if he struck a freeman's female slave and has caused her to have a miscarriage, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. So, yeah, not as much. Okay, so I mentioned that I wanted to also look at family, because we're going to use this conversation around family as a way to entrance into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and their laws. Because at the end of the day, this is the stuff that I find, this is stuff that I find interesting. And this is also, when we talk about family, it's the intersection of personal responsibility versus communal responsibility. And we're talking about relationships and all that stuff. And of course, one of the things that gets dealt with very commonly in the Hebrew Bible, which people seem to be worked up about, is infidelity. Infidelity. And what I want to do, at least in the beginning of this series, is look at how infidelity is treated relative to these different codexes of law, and contrast and compare it with how we see it in the Bible. We'll get into that next week. Today we're just going to enter into the Old Testament Bible. But this, keep this as stuff in mind. And by the way, hang on to these if you can, both the Code of Hammurabi handout, but the one from last week as well, because as we go through the Old Testament law, we're going to be referring back to this stuff, right? Okay. To say, hey, here's what it looked like in Hebrew society. What did it look like in Babylonian society versus Assyrian society, et cetera, et cetera?
Would you remind us to bring it?
And yes, and what I'll do is every week following, I'll have a couple of copies of each just in case you forget it. And I will be attaching both of these files to the weekly email that goes up this week, so you can download them onto your personal device and or print them off as you need. Okay, so here we go. Jumping right in, metaphorically and literally. If the wife of a man, okay, who's doing the thing here? It's the woman, right? Is caught lying with another man, They shall bind them and throw them into the water. It's
hard to picture that.
I know. Bear with me. If the husband of the woman wishes to spare his wife, then the king shall spare his servant. Okay, so what's going on here? The language is a little bit weird, but we're assuming that this other man is, I guess, qualifies as a servant of the king. Okay, so long story short, if the husband forgives the wife's infidelity, the guy doesn't get thrown into the water either.
Assuming it was a servant.
I was gonna say, like, well, yeah. Right? If it's a plebeian or if it's a slave, she might be straight out of luck, right? But the glaring holes here is there is a one-directional, seemingly, motive of adultery. So it's the woman sleeping with the man, okay? They didn't sleep together. She slept with him. And so notice how the law follows is that if the husband agrees to forgive the wife, then the other guy is spared. It's not that simple. And again, in a modern context, in a post-Me Too world, we have thankfully, and it's not just post-Me Too. It's this is hundreds of years of societal civilizational development. We have begun to understand that romantic relationships are complicated, and it's rarely, except in the case of rape, a one-directional thing, right?
Well, back in that society, the woman was really given to the other man by his father.
Exactly. So Carolyn is saying, something we have to keep in mind, which we're absolutely pulling into this, is the position of woman in society, which is that she's roughly property either of her father or of her husband eventually. So again, well, boy, the double standard nature of that, right? So she can't own property. She can't really make decisions for herself. But if she gets caught in bed with another guy, she's the one.
It's her fault.
It's her fault. So
Now in our society, he'd be blown away.
well, it depends, right? It depends who catches him. But in the modern world, we're still kind of figuring out how do we determine consent, right? And is there abuse of power, right? Because in our society, it's not so easy to say no in certain situations, right? And I don't necessarily want to. And I'm maybe not necessarily the person to pick that apart. But I want to point out here is that this is how our world is different, and things have gotten significantly better in that arena. But don't let better be the enemy of or don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like there's still room for this. These folks, lest we belittle them too much, we're still there's an effort. There's an effort here, right? There is room for forgiveness of this woman's infidelity. Again, it assumes a specific role here. It assumes that only women can seduce men. And to be fair, that mindset still exists in our day and age. It is alive and well, right? You dressed too provocatively, he couldn't control himself, right? That's
She was asking for it.
yeah, she was asking for. That is absolutely present in here. But not to give them an excuse, but it's 1700 BCE in a patriarchal world. What's our excuse? Okay.
But we have let color of skin eat into this.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's okay. Repeating for the stream, color of skin, does that factor into this, right? One of the things to keep in, well, I don't know to answer that question. So most of the people that we're talking about that live in this part of the world are darker of skin, hues of olive approaching brown. A European from the Gaul came into this part of the world, they would be pale and strange looking with their light colored hair. If you're moving from Babylon towards Egypt, you might have some distinguishing physical characteristics. But again, North Africa, historically you got to move further south into Central Africa and Southern Africa before you get the much darker skin tones. So you could probably argue that most of the people look the same. And again, this is a different situation of slavery. This is slavery separated from racial or ethnic boundaries. It's complex. I shouldn't say that outright. Ancient equivalents of racism absolutely exist, right? These are human beings we're talking about here. It's just different, okay? The racism, as we might understand, well, let's use the word prejudice, can be much more fluid, but the understanding of what defines a people from a people is a different thing than just simply the color of your skin, right? It's beliefs factor into this, but again, it can be much more fluid. For example, if your tribe is fighting with their tribe, you might look the same, believe roughly the same, but your tribal affiliation means that you are, at best a slave in that society. Does that make sense? I'm kind of meandering here, but it's complicated. But that's a good thought, Gail. Okay, now we get theoretically the reverse. Law 130. If a man has ravished another's betrothed wife, but notice the qualifier, who is a virgin, okay, while still living in her father's house. So this is a little bit redundant because, again, in these societies, an unmarried woman lives with her father. That's how it works. While still living in her father's house and has been caught in the act. Again, important qualifier here. That man shall be put to death. The woman shall go free. Why do we need that statement? Okay, so again, in place of the word ravish, we can input the modern term rape. So if a man rapes another's wife while she's still a virgin, the man is killed. The woman goes free. So in this rare case, maybe it's rare, I don't know, but in this specific case, the woman is exempt from the responsibility. But again,
What does free mean?
Free, but then notice the qualifier here, caught in the act. So if he does the deed and gets away, and the woman makes a complaint, who is now, by the way, defiled, quote unquote, how does she pursue justice? Okay?
She's disowned, probably.
And and this still happens as well. I mean, this is not to demonize other cultures, but this still happens in what we refer to as the Middle East and other parts of that world, and arguably in parts of America too, in just different contexts. Okay. She might still be a child, and probably is, because marriageable age is essentially puberty, right? In this world. So yes, and the fact that she's betrothed but not yet married indicates that there is this. She's in the lead-up process to becoming a woman. Yeah.
Well, and she's also now used goods, and he's not
Yes.
gotten what he purchased.
Yes. And this is the issue.
Yeah.
This is the big issue here, because again, pointing out the law here is not necessarily about on behalf of the woman. It's on behalf of the man who was about to own this woman. This is who is important according to this law. Okay, this isn't about things were so bad back then. I mean, they were, but it's about understanding how people understood the relative value of human beings. Because this seems totally crazy, but this is what putting a law together looks like. This is what codifying a law looks like, is that somebody makes decisions regarding, okay, what's the value of a human life, right? And that exists in our world as well, too. Medical malpractice, right? If somebody dies on the operating table, was it the surgeon's fault, right? And if it was the surgeon's fault, what happens, right? I mean, and again, that's a really, really complicated situation, right? And there are a lot of things to take into consideration, which is if surgeons are so afraid of medical malpractice, they're not going to want to be surgeons anymore. So we've got that to balance. But as well, if you've got a surgeon that showed up after a pint of whiskey and his hands are, he needed that to stop his hands from shaking, and somebody dies on the operating table, or well, there's a whole bunch of scenarios that I could throw out there. Anyways, it's complicated, but these kind of questions are still relevant in our society. What is the relative value of a human being? It goes into our conversation around abortion as well, too. What is the value of a human fetus? Is it the same value as an adult? And that sounds crass, that sounds cynical and quantitative, but this is what we do as societies, is we figure this stuff out, right? And it carries over into what's the value of a non-citizen in our society, right? So if somebody crosses the border legally or illegally, right, what's the value of their life according to our legal code? Is it equivalent or less than? Right? These are things that we have to think about. And they're important because we who draw influence, draw inspiration, and listen for the word of God in our scriptures, we should have a voice to contribute into these conversations. And one of the ways in which we develop this voice is understanding the history and the context of the laws that are in our Bible, in our scripture. Because what we're kind of discovering here is it's not so simple as to point at Leviticus 18 and say, here it is. God said it. That's what the rule is. Because there are several things at stake here. One of which is, well, define God said it. Right? Is that how it happened? Or were there, as we were talking about last week, perhaps a set of laws that were already in practice, which God through human agents influences, helps to develop and progress, pushes people in a direction that is more just, right? One of the things that we're going to look at, I'll stop preaching in a second, I promise. One of the things that we're going to look at especially is how the Hebrew law makes allocation for the poor and the foreigner, right? So there's one of those really important laws, which is the law of leaving 10% of your field unharvested for the poor and the foreigner, right? So that people don't starve to death, right? What's that equivalent in our modern day society? Can we draw influence from that? Is there further to take that, right? Anyways, okay. We're going to keep going a little bit with this, and then we're going to read our Bibles, I promise. But again, we're going to be referring back to this stuff over and over again. If a man has accused his wife, but she has not been caught lying with another man, she shall take an oath in the name of God and return to her house. Feels like there's a part 2 to this. Okay. That's Law 131. Unfortunately, we do not have laws 132 through 137. What's this oath about? How do we determine whether the oath is true or not? I'm pointing this one out because this is one that bears significant relevance to some laws we're going to look at in a little bit. We're going to move to the 10 Commandments in just a second, which is the law in the 10 Commandments that says, you shall not use the name of the Lord in vain. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. So often, that's about the 4-letter words that we use, right? You know what they are? There's a George Carlin skit all about this. That's not what that law is about, believe it or not. You can continue to tell your kids and grandkids that that's what it's about. But specifically, what that law referred to was this. Taking an oath in the name of God was essentially calling God down and saying, God, I'm calling you as a witness to my statement. In other words, this woman has been accused of lying with another man. She's claiming otherwise, so she is asked to make an oath to God, saying, essentially, I swear by God that I did not lie with this man. And in doing so, according to this society, this context, they're assuming that if she has, in fact, lied, there will be divine consequences. Now, what I'm curious about, but again, we don't have it, is in laws 132 through 137, is if they leave it up to divine consequences, or if there is follow-up to this, and how now the state plays the role of the divine consequence. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Because we're going to run into this over and over again in the Old Testament as well, because here's the question. So Jerry accuses Ben of stealing his cow. Ben says, that's not Jerry's cow, that's my cow. It's always been my cow. Jerry's cow died last year, and he's just jealous and wants my cow. We have no way of proving whether it's Jerry's cow or Ben's cow, right? So then we maybe call in neighbors. Is that Jerry's cow or is that Ben's cow? I have no idea. I don't pay attention to Jerry's and Ben's cows. So now it's left to Jerry. Jerry says, I make an oath to God that that's my cow. And Ben says, I make an oath to God that that's my cow. Now do you understand why there is a commandment that says, you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain? That's one of the worst things that you can do. And what Solomon would do is cut that cow in half, and they'd each get half a beef, which is a pretty good deal. It's expensive.
Or you'd have a trial by whatever.
Oh, totally.
Version.
For example, the water trial that we had last week, which I forgot to talk about, right? Which, as far as I understand, is equivalent to being tied up and thrown in the water. That's the water trial.
Is that like the witchcraft in Salem? Where they...
Similar. That was more chain them up, see if they float.
Yeah.
If they float, they're a witch, and then you burn them.
So instead you want to drown?
Well, if you're accused of being a witch in that day and age, it's just bad. There's not a whole lot of recourse for you. But in this case, as I understand it, it was tie them up, throw them in the water. If they manage to escape, obviously they're favored and they're innocent, so let them go. So again, everybody was Houdini. Everybody was practicing underwater escapes. And yet, one of the problems here, of course, is that if you're being tied up with natural fiber bindings, what happens when you get immersed in water? They tighten. Yeah. And so, it's tough. It's tough.
Well, I just can't get over though, it's all based on economics, it's not based on relationships at all. It doesn't seem.
That's a wonderful insight. So for the stream, Gail just said it's all based on economics, it's not based on relationship. By the way, this is one of the markers that we look at in the course of the development of codices of law, again, is how do we punish and or rehabilitate an offender in light of these things. And we mentioned it last week. If a fine is the punishment, that law does not exist for the wealthy, right? Unless it scales according to income and or, okay. But the same issue is at stake here is, at least in these codices of law, the way that things were handled was through economic punishments. It makes sense, though, if you think about it. Again, these are societies that are patriarchal in nature. They're very much value-based societies, and it's really again in a world without mass communication, in a world without a professional policing force, with all these things. This is actually, and again, not saying that the individual cases are good, but it's actually remarkable. This is an important turning point in human civilization, right? Is that all of a sudden the law? Because imagine the opposite scenario, which is that the law there is a codex. It's not publicly available, right? It's only accessible by the ruling class, and it's not necessarily universally applied, right? Okay, so this is just overtly the law benefits a certain subset of the population, and the rest are kind of left to the whims. This is what, by the way, Middle Ages Europe looks like, by and large. You live to the whim of your feudal lord, right? The law of the church may apply, it may not, depending on which overlord your prince pays fealty to. But again, we hear horror stories about, in medieval ages how noble lords had essentially first rights to, or first option to the women, to the peasant women that were in there. There was no repercussion for them for, taking whichever woman that they wanted, whatever he was going to do with them afterwards. At least in this case, right, there are rules. And so very important thing. Okay, so I'm preaching again. Okay.
Who enforced these?
Oh, sorry, I never really directly answered that. So who enforced these? The wealthy, the powerful, via the military, right? So via a professional soldier class that was responsible for this stuff. And you would have magistrates, right, who were responsible for levying out punishment and stuff like that. There is an infrastructure here. This is not completely. And the fact that this Codex of laws existed implies that there is a legal infrastructure that exists for the enforcement of them.
Right, but it also assisted the rising of the middle class, if you want to say that. It restrained the power of the wealthy.
Absolutely.
And that's the first time it ever happened.
Absolutely. So it assists the elevation of the middle class, the creation of a middle class, and it restrains the power of the wealthy. Absolutely, right? And again, it's easy for us to kind of like poke fun at these and how bad they are, but I hope that we appreciate the value, especially in regards to the development of human civilization. And again, not to belabor the point, but it just points out to us how important it is, how vital a role our legal system plays in our civilization, right? So we talk about the impacts of Supreme Court decisions, right? Now we understand why these are anxiety-inducing, right? We can see how legal interpretation and legal application can shift according to political issues, right? We see it right here. This is what that looks like. Okay, let's talk about divorce, because this is where I actually wanted to get to, and we're still going to look at the Old Testament real quick. Okay, if a man wishes to divorce his wife who has not borne him children,
Which one are you on?
141. Or 138, sorry, 138. If a man wishes to divorce his wife who has not borne him children, he shall give her money to the amount of her marriage price, which is, what's a marriage price? Dowry, essentially, yeah. And he shall make good to her the dowry which she brought from her father's house, and then he may divorce her. Okay, sorry, distinction of terms here. In this case, marriage price is the price that is paid by the husband's family for the quote-unquote purchase of her. The dowry, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, is the money the goods that she brings with her in the relationship that is paid by the bride's family.
So he has to double pay her.
He has to double pay, yeah. So if a man wishes to divorce his wife, again, important qualifier here, who has not borne him children? This is going to be important when we get into the Bible, by the way. This is the scenario. Okay, and again, fortunately, we don't have 139 or 140, but 141, this is a comedy of, it's not really a comedy, but it's interesting. If the wife of a man who is living in her husband's house, that's a clause that I really want to pay attention to there, because I wonder what it means if she's not living in his house. Is that even a viable scenario? Okay. If she has persisted in going out, has acted the fool, has wasted her house, that's a typo there or something, has belittled her husband, he shall prosecute her. Okay. What's that mean? If her husband has said, I divorce her, she shall go her way, he shall give her nothing as a price of divorce. If her husband has said, I will not divorce her, he may take another woman to wife. The wife shall live as a slave in her husband's house. Okay. I hope we appreciate the total opportunity for abuse of this system, right? Okay, so let's say Jerry's married to Mary, right? And despite 20 years of blissful matrimony, Jerry has decided to upgrade to a younger model. Jerry laments how Mary has acted the fool, has nagged him, has just goes out and parties all, I don't know, I'm making up a scenario here, just bear with me, right? And so Jerry says, you know what, Mary, I'm not going to kick you out, but you are not quality wife material anymore. So I'm going to marry Susie. You're Susie's slave now. Can you imagine how Susie, who's 20 years younger than Mary, would handle this situation? Okay.
But if he kicks her out, then she's on her own and considered a prostitute
Yes.
at that point. So maybe
Yes.
that's what she would prefer.
Which this is in our biblical law as well too, right? So Linda said if she kicks her out and Mary is on the streets, Mary doesn't have any options, right? Women can't own property. A single woman who is not married is essentially falls into the category of prostitute, whether she's actually involved in the act or not. We run into this in our biblical narrative as well, right? Again, this is why we're reading this stuff.
This is a lot in Shauna's society also.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are things that are still relevant today, unfortunately. Okay, we're not going to keep going, but I do want to read 142 real quick because this is the reciprocal. If a woman has hated her husband and said, "You shall not possess me," her past shall be inquired into as to what she lacks. If she has been discreet and has no vice, and her husband has gone out and has greatly belittled her, the woman has not blamed. She shall take her marriage portion and go off to her father's house. This, as far as I understand it, is the singular recourse for getting out of a marriage as a woman. But you have to subject yourself to a state inquiry, essentially a background check. Can you imagine if this played out? Right? In modern society? Oh God. Hopefully not.
And then if they decide she wasn't as great as she
Yeah, then what?
then she gets
Drowned.
Yeah. But does she get tied up and drowned? Does she get the option to escape? No, apparently not. Just, yeah, straight in. Okay. I'm sorry, this took longer than I thought, but it's so much fun. Okay, let's turn real quickly to Ten Commandments. And this is going to be our entry. I'm not going to go as late today, I promise.
Sure.
No.
The one that bothers me though, before we move on.
Please.
154.
The man there we go. If a man has committed incest with his daughter, that man shall be banished from the city.
And yet the wife will be drowned if she belittles her husband.
Yeah, the wife will be drowned if she's belittled her husband. Talk about proportional response to stuff. Okay, sorry. No, and again, if you're bored, feel free to read through these. It is a really interesting window into human society in that day and age. Maybe read it in parts. It gets pretty heavy after a while. And I don't think I need to say it, but I just want to say none of this is good, and none of it should we look at and try to model a modern legal system off of, right? Are we on the same page with that? But it still has value, okay, which is kind of the foundation of this course. Okay, Exodus chapter 20. Sorry, I said just find the 10 Commandments. I should have given you the appropriate text. Exodus chapter 20. And the reason we're going to start here is this is the portion of biblical law that I think most of us are familiar with. We're aware of the rest of the Mosaic law, but not well versed into it. So my argument is let's start in a familiar place. And the great thing, in addition to other things about the Ten Commandments, is they're really kind of a wonderful summary of what is essentially the Levitical law. I mean, in fact, this bears particular import in that Jesus then summarizes the summary, right? So all the law and the commandments can be summed up into this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? So it's a great place to start. So here we go. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. 1. Part either 1b or 2, depending on how you number these. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to worship them. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. Excuse me. But showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Golden calf. I mean, this is for me, the humor of the book of Exodus is it's only 12 chapters later that Aaron, the first Levitical priest, the brother of Moses, the receiver of the law of God, creates a golden idol out of this jewelry of people. So, 12 chapters. How many chapters has it been since we've had a workplace accident? 12. Okay, number 7, or number 3, 4. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Okay, this is an NRSV translation that is relatively recent. It's like 2 or 3 iterations ago. So you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Okay, do you get the understanding here? I swear in the name of God that I, Jerry, did not steal Ben's cow, right? So this is essentially the divine response saying, just don't bring my name into it. Whether you are guilty or innocent, I don't want to be brought into your petty squabbles over a cow. I don't want to be used as leverage. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. This is one of the most important of all of the commandments because it gives us this beautiful insight into how Israel, well, not Israel yet, but how the Hebrew people were doing something a little bit different. This is one of the first examples of a universal application of a law regardless of class, right? Regardless of free person, noble, slave. And it's so universal, in fact, that it applies to cattle and foreigners. That seems like it's almost a footnote, but it's a really, really important footnote because, again, in our modern day and age, foreigners are people who live in different countries, right? Not that big of a deal depending on whether they cross the border according to our laws or not according to our laws. In this day and age, a foreigner might be somebody that you fought against in the last battle. A foreigner is a member of a different tribe. A foreigner is somebody who might perhaps speak a different language, not that big of a deal, but it's somebody who does not operate according to your rules, your society, right? They are one of the most dangerous, but also one of the most unprotected peoples in ancient society. If you are going into a land that is not your own, you're taking your own life in your hands. We have repeat examples of this in our own scripture. Judges 19, one of the worst stories in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, when Abraham goes to his cousin Lot's place in Sodom, right, and is attempted to be assaulted because of being a foreigner. This just gives us a little bit of insight into how dangerous it was to be a world traveler in that day and age. Because you were entering into a society where you were not protected by the law. And yet, in the 10 Commandments, we have a universal application of a law, which says everybody, regardless of status, takes a day off on Sundays. Or Saturdays, or metaphorical day, etc., etc.
But Jesus, in his parable, when he healed somebody on the Sabbath,
Yes.
that's
So Carolyn brought up a story which we just had a little bit ago, which is Jesus healing on the Sabbath. But okay, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but this is something to think about as well too. Is that we can point to something like the 10 Commandments, and yet this isn't the end all be all either, because for every commandment that's here, there is a scenario that tests the boundaries of that. For example, Here's the law. It says, you shall do no work. Here are the people that are included in that. What's work? And is there perhaps a scenario in which doing work, for example, healing somebody, right, which could be argued to be work, is justifiable on the Sabbath because it trumps? Okay, you're bringing up, the whole point of this. Yes.
I'll shut up.
No, it's good. It's good, Carolyn. That's a foretaste of the feast to come. 4 and 6. Sorry, this is the 4 and 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. He had the justification. The rest in the seventh day, blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated. Okay. Then here we get the what I refer to as the grab bag. Honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Notice there's no laws about cutting off hands. Honor the Lord, honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Ben and Jerry make great ice cream too. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Okay, pause there. We're not going to, well, we can read the rest of chapter 20, but I don't have time today. Here's what I invite you to think about over the course of this next week, is what is said here, and what is implied here, and what is left unsaid, okay? Because again, when we talk about legal systems, right, no matter what rule you make, there's going to be an exception to it, and it's going to require some extent of interpretation, right? That's theoretically why lawyers get paid as much money as they do. No lawyer bashing today. That'll come later. Where's Greg? No, no, I'm being facetious. But for me, one of the most powerful pieces of this section of Scripture that we call the Ten Commandments is what is implied through what is being said here. And especially if we read the Code of Hammurabi, on which many of the Hebrew laws are based, or if we read the codes that we looked at last week, looked at Ishtar, and I'm making up names on the spot, I can't remember them off the top of my head. And we contrast them with what's going on here. Again, knowing how people were valued in this code or in previous codes, what is the significance of simply saying, you shall not murder? Who's the you, right? Does this you discriminate on wealthy versus poor, on citizen versus foreigner, or is it applied universally?
Sounds universal.
Sounds universal. You shall not commit adultery. Who's committing the adultery? Is it the man? Is it the woman? Is there perhaps the idea being introduced here that it's not so simple as a unidirectional adultery? Anyways. I'll skip ahead. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Does it matter if the one that's claiming false witness is a peasant against a noble, right? Or are the rules the same no matter who they're applied to? Left unsaid here. When we get into Levitical law, the Mosaic law, we're going to see that these things, which seem so simple in the Ten Commandments, get discussed about, right? Good way to think of it is that the Levitical laws, the Mosaic laws, are essentially the footnotes to the Ten Commandments, okay? They are, as people are trying to figure out these exceptions to the rules and these unique cases, laws are created to address them, okay? For example, says you shall not commit adultery. But what if the guy who was leaving my house last night and happened to be walking out of my wife's bedroom is the son of the priest, and I know if I make an accusation against him, is it perhaps just easier to get a new wife? What's the story there? So anyways, these are the things I want you to think about. And we'll talk about this stuff next week. Thank you for your time and your patience and your conversation. So for next week, we're going to come back to the Ten Commandments, and we're going to start to kind of just pick out one by one. I'm not going to tell you what to read ahead of time because it would be too much. But what we're gonna do is, as we pick up these individual commandments, we're gonna go to applicable Levitical Mosaic laws that begin to interpret these. Make sense?
Count, very